Okay, you are saying that the 70 weeks of Daniel have already been fulfilled, that they were finished with the stoning of Stephen. I didn't even realize this was a teaching until I got on TikTok, but I did hear it pretty quickly after I got on TikTok and began teaching prophecy, that there are those who believe this. So let's just look at scripture and see if that is accurate. The 70 weeks of Daniel is prophesied or was given to Daniel in chapter 9 of his book. So let's read it and see what it says. 70 sevens are decreed for your people, his people, speaking to Daniel, meaning the Jews, and 70 sevens are decreed for them. So that's saying, as we read through it, we gain a little bit more understanding that 70 sets of 7-year time frames have been decreed for the Jews for a specific reason to accomplish specific goals. Let's read what those are. I'm going to begin at the beginning again. 77s are decreed for your people and your holy city, so this also has to do with Jerusalem, to finish transgression, to put an end to sin, to atone for wickedness, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal up vision and prophecy, and to anoint the most holy. So right off the bat, if we say that all 70 of those 7-year time frames have been fulfilled, which is a total of 490 years, then we are saying that all of these things that were decreed for the Jews and Jerusalem have been fulfilled. Putting an end to sin, atone for wickedness, yes, Christ did that. To bring in everlasting righteousness, not the world I'm living in. Seal up vision and prophecy, multitudes of prophecies remain. And to anoint the most holy. And that is referencing Christ ruling and reigning over the nations from Jerusalem during the millennial reign. So we see that not all of those things have been fulfilled. They have been decreed to be fulfilled during the 490 years. So clearly that is not the case. So let's continue reading. Verse 25, Daniel 9. Know and understand this: from the issuing of the decree to restore and rebuild Jerusalem until the anointed one, the ruler, comes, there will be 7 sevens and 62 sevens. So here we see that from the issuing of the decree to restore and rebuild Jerusalem, which was historically around 444 BC, we can read about that in Nehemiah 2, to rebuild Jerusalem until the anointed one, who is Messiah, Christ, would come. There will be 7 sevens and 62 sevens. So we've got a total of 69 of those 70, 69 of those 7-year time frames that are going to be fulfilled or finished between the time that the decree was issued to restore and rebuild Jerusalem until the Christ, the anointed one, would come. And that totals 483 years. So 483 years from the time that the decree was issued to rebuild Jerusalem until Christ came. So we've got 483 of the 490 that are fulfilled prior to the death and resurrection of Christ, as we're going to see here that it's talking about his death. It says in verse 26, after the 62 sevens, the anointed one will be cut off and will have nothing. Again, that's referencing Christ. So we see that 7 sevens is what it took, or 49 years is what it took for the restoration and the rebuilding of Jerusalem, and then a total of 483 before Christ was crucified. So again, we're at 483 out of 490. Let's continue looking for the last 7. It goes on to say, the people of the ruler who will come will destroy the city and the sanctuary. No mention of the final 7 years. But this does tell us where the Antichrist comes from. We learn that the people of the ruler who will come is who destroys the city and the sanctuary. The city and the sanctuary was destroyed by the Romans in 70 AD. So that tells us that this ruler who will come, who is of these people, so the Antichrist, is from the revived Roman Empire. Still no mention of the final 7 years, though. So we're at 70 AD right now in the text. No final 7 years, and that's far beyond the stoning of Stephen. It says, the end will come like a flood. War will continue to the end, and desolations have been decreed. Now we have this he's the one who is from the one that destroyed the city and the sanctuary. So this he is the Antichrist in verse 27, will confirm a covenant with many for 1 7. Note this, in the middle of the 7, he will put an end to sacrifice and offering, and on a wing of the temple, he will set up an abomination that causes desolation until the end that is decreed is poured out on him. So in verse 26, we have the destruction of the temple. That occurred in 70 AD. And then as we move down into verse 27, we can see clearly that temple of the Jewish people is going to be rebuilt again. We're not told when. We're told a time at the end that it will be rebuilt, because the Antichrist will set up an abomination that causes desolation in the temple. We see that as well in 2 Thessalonians 2, the fulfillment of that when he goes into the temple and proclaims to be God. So we have in verse 26 the temple destroyed when there has only been 69 of the 70 weeks fulfilled, leaving 7 years not fulfilled yet. So we have a final 7 years yet that has to be fulfilled. That is one and the same as what we call the tribulation in Revelation chapters 6 through 19. We see that exact same time frame, the 7 years, referenced in Revelation 11 and 12, broken down into 2 halves. So 483 years decreed for the Jews has been fulfilled. The years stopped with the death of Christ, and we are now waiting for those final 7 years to be fulfilled, to accomplish the rest of what was decreed for the Jews, found again in verse 24 that I've already read a couple times. So we do have 7 years remaining. We're told in verse 27 that it is the time of the end when these 7 years will be fulfilled. And we also know from verse 27 that the Antichrist will come from the revived Roman Empire. This ruler that will come is from the revived Roman Empire. He's from the people that destroyed the city and the sanctuary in 70 AD. That he will, after 3.5 years, he will confirm a covenant with the Jews for 7 years and others, because it's with many. But the Jews are always the focus of end days prophecy, so we know that they are a part of this covenant. He will confirm a covenant with them for 7 years. There we pick up the final 7 years decreed for the Jews. And in that 7 years, we learn from this passage in Daniel 9 that a temple will be rebuilt. The Antichrist will go into it. We learn from 2 Thessalonians 2 and proclaim to be God, 2 Thessalonians 2:4. And that is the abomination of desolation that Jesus also referenced in Matthew 24:15. And that at that same time, that is midway into the tribulation, 3.5 years in, he breaks that covenant, the Antichrist does, and he stops the sacrifices and offerings that are at that time being made in the Jewish temple. So are all of the 70 weeks fulfilled? No. The 70th week remains and is, in my opinion, looking at the world, at the door. As we can see, the prophecies from Revelation are about to be fulfilled. World war, global famine, inflation, pestilence, global government, global one world currency, and more. So we have 7 years left, and it is imminent and will be preceded by the rapture of the church.